Plants, they're so familiar and yet at the same time mysterious. They surround us every day, but a lot of times just kind of fade into the background. At the same time, they provide most of our food, and food for really just about all land-living organisms. And so they are immensely important. But like I said, also really kind of mysterious. You know, what would it be like to be able to make your own food by just reaching your hands out into the sun? What would it be like to not have a nervous system, to not really be aware of the world around you, and yet still be able to know up from down, and to know where light is coming from and bend that way, to grow your roots toward an area of more water or nutrients? They really have remarkable abilities for being so simple. Also, think about this one. Somewhere in the world, a seed has fallen to the ground. And before you're done with this class and take your final exam, that plant will have flowered, set seed, and completed its life cycle. And yet another seed from a different plant may just be starting out, not be any taller than that by the time you take your final exam, and still live another 1,000 years. What an incredible range. Let's take a look at some of the plant kingdom and appreciate a little more about it.
In our classification scheme, we're talking about these guys right here.
Where plants live is simple. They live on land. They got to put their roots into the soil and their leaves up into the air to gather sunlight. The anatomy of a plant, or its structure, has some similarities with ours. It's made of many cells, so you can see it with your naked eye. You don't need a microscope for any plant that I can think of anyway. Each of their cells, unlike ours, is surrounded by a cell wall, which makes them fairly firm. Actually, that's what helps them stand up. Now, that cell wall is made out of a carbohydrate called cellulose. And cellulose is a complex carbohydrate that we cannot digest. Now, fungi and bacteria can both digest it, but we can't. So this makes up the fiber in our diets. What it does for the plant is provide some protection. Actually, if you're wearing a shirt or any other clothes made of cotton, it's made of the same stuff. And that's what plant cell walls are like. They're not rigid like a concrete cell wall. They're not quite that firm, but they do provide sort of a boundary around them. We'll talk more about that in a minute. How it pertains to us is we can't digest the stuff. Bacteria in our intestines digest a little bit of it, but most of it passes through.
Plant cells have a lot of similarities to our own cells. Their DNA is stored in a nucleus. They have rough endoplasmic reticulum and a Golgi, and even cytoskeleton. They have, of course, a plasma membrane around their cells. Some of the key differences: their cell wall. So the plasma membrane is shown is this yellow line, and right outside of that is this green box. And it can be fairly thick depending on the plant cell, and it often gives them kind of a boxy appearance when you look at them under a microscope. And that's their supporting structure. They also have a vacuole. A few human cells have them, but almost every plant cell is filled with this giant vacuole filled with mostly water, but also some salts, especially potassium, and sugars as well. And then, of course, there's the chloroplast that does photosynthesis. Under the microscope, this is what that looks like. So see these boxy cells and then the green chloroplasts inside of them? And then over here on the left side, we see some really thick cell walls. It's stained in red. And these are the tubes that carry water and sugars and salts around the plant.
So in terms of the food that we eat, we don't eat sticks, right? This is almost all cell walls. In fact, it's all dead and dried up. So everything left here is pretty much cell wall material. When we select plants to eat, we choose something like spinach, which much thinner, softer cell walls that we can break down to get to the good stuff inside the cells. Now, we do eat some plants with firmer cell walls like the sweet potato or a carrot. And usually we cook these first to break down or soften up the cell wall, again, to get to the good stuff on the inside.
Well, how do plants without wood stand up? They do it using water pressure. And so this involves osmosis, the movement of water into the cell, which creates turgor or pressure inside the cell. So let's focus on this cell over here on the right. This vacuole is filled with salts and sugars, which draws water into the cell. This creates a bunch of outward pressure, which is held in by that cell wall. Otherwise, it would burst. And this creates basically a firm cell. And all those firm cells stack up on top of one another, and the plant can stand up.
And then plants are also modular. What I mean by that is they have these kind of repeating parts, these leaves, and they can make as many of them as the environment will allow, and they can even replace them. I mean, what would it be like to remove it and grow another one for a finger? Ever removed a finger and just grown a new one? About all we can do is manage to regrow our fingernails and maybe some hair, but it's not like plants. You know, all these parts, if you break off a stem, you grow a new one. Break off a leaf, you grow a new one. That's kind of an interesting feature of plants.
Now, there are about 369,000 species of plants, and I'd love to take you through a bunch, but I'm just going to do a quick rundown of the 4 major groups, starting with the mosses. These are the simplest plants. They're tied to wet areas, partly because of these reproductive structures here that produce actually swimming sperm. So although plants don't move on their own other than by growing or spreading seed, there are some parts of plants, and just a few of them, that actually can motor themselves through fluid. And so mosses, liverworts are simple plants, no seeds, stuck by water. Ferns are kind of similar. Actually, here's this really intricate swimming sperm from this plant called a horsetail fern. Familiar with other ferns and these groups called lycopods? They're a little more complicated, but they still make spores and not seeds. So they're the ferns. Probably a little more familiar with the conifers. So this is part of a larger group called the gymnosperms. These are usually woody plants. They make cones rather than seeds, and typically are these tall Christmas trees. Even junipers would fall into this group. But the most abundant in terms of biomass and in terms of the number of species today are the flowering plants. And these guys obviously produce flowers, which result in fruits.
Now, if you've done much gardening, you know all about plant reproduction. You put seeds in the ground, and that's sexual reproduction. Not all plants produce seeds, but most of the ones you're familiar with do. Those come from flowers, and that's reproduction. In fact, those seeds are usually in some sort of fruit, and fruit is a lot of what we eat as food. It contains a lot of nutritious material, easier to eat than most of the leaves, and so plants are important. Their reproductive cycle is very important to our own nutrition. You also know in the garden that many plants will reproduce asexually. They do in nature as well. Like the mint plant that I held up a minute ago, if you look underground, kind of the messier parts, this little runner here also sends up new mint shoots. And so that's one example among many of asexual reproduction in plants. But most can reproduce in both fashions. In fact, I'd probably say that all plants can reproduce sexually, but many can reproduce asexually as well.
Let's talk just briefly about that plant life cycle for flowering plants. So here we see that flower, which has both male parts that produce the pollen and the female parts. And these divide by meiosis and then mitosis again. And so that pollen is actually a multicellular organism, which is strange. And so is that ovule. And that pollen lands on the flower and grows into it, and that sperm nucleus fertilizes one of these ovules and becomes a seed, which is planted, and then the cycle starts over. In flowering plants, the container for those seeds is called a fruit and encourages the dispersal of those plants, sometimes by another animal eating this fruit and then depositing it somewhere else in a nice little pile of fertilizer.
Of course, in terms of the plant's energy needs, photosynthesis. That's really where it's at for them. They are able to capture sunlight energy, use it to put molecules together and make sugars, which, of course, they store in roots and leaves and fruits that we often take advantage of as our food source, as does pretty much any other land organism on Earth.
They capture energy. They capture sunlight. This makes them primary producers, both for us and any other organism that eats them, and the organisms that eat them, and the organisms that eat them. And they do this using chloroplasts. Each cell is full of them, and they're chock full of these membranes full of the pigment chlorophyll. This green pigment captures sunlight and excites electrons, and that is stored as sugars. One funny side note, not all plants are photosynthetic. See this orange thing? It's actually a non-photosynthetic plant sucking the juices out of another plant. There are a few of them. They're kind of rare, but seem worth mentioning. Inside the chloroplast, so here's the plant cell up here, and there's a bunch. Light comes in, strikes the chlorophyll within those membranes, and steals an electron out of water. This produces oxygen, which is good for us. And that energy is temporarily stored in these molecules and then passed off to carbon dioxide and used to make sugars and other organic molecules. Basically, the exact opposite of cellular respiration, but one of the most important processes on the planet.
So plants, pretty amazing, right? I mean, not only do they provide almost all of our food, but they provide a lot of our clothing fibers, the wood to build our houses, and they're beautiful to look at. We plant them in our yards to appreciate. They're the grass beneath our feet. So many different uses. They even provide a huge number of medicines that help heal us when we're sick. Not only that, but they clean up the air, they keep the soil from eroding, and the list goes on and on. I hope that in this short time, you've come to appreciate them for the amazing life forms that they are. Certainly life on Earth would not be possible without them. I hope this helps you look at them in somewhat of a new light. Till next time, keep appreciating life, especially plants.